Maize, staple food. In Kenya. Maize import, business. And this is something that we see every year. Farmers in the country, they produce maize. They want to sell maize to the government through NCPB. They want to dictate the price of maize. NCPB wants to dictate the price of maize. Politics wants to dictate the price of maize. And then at some point we see imports. Do we have sufficient maize that has been produced in the country? Do we have cheaper maize that's available from neighboring countries? What's the cost of production of maize in this country? What's the cost of production of maize in neighboring countries? This is a conversation that happens all the time. And whenever we have this talk, Agri-Talk, in the Situation Room, where we promote meaningful discourse on agriculture, food security, and agribusiness, we've talked about grain for a while. Now, recently, we saw the authority that's in charge of food security in Kenya, and this is the agriculture and food. In fact, there's also, they put the word fisheries at some point, I don't know when.
Yes, somewhere.
Agriculture, food, fisheries authority. They had issued an instruction that said, ban the importation of maize from neighboring countries, specifically Tanzania and Uganda. And there had been various concerns about this, so the presence of aflatoxin in the grain. Is that good enough or not? There was a lot of pushback and outcry from the traders who were saying, come on, we have already made our orders, we're already moving this. And then the government seems to have buckled under pressure. And the cabinet secretary in charge of agriculture, who's in charge of this AFA, comes out and says, no. This issue has been taken out of context. What we want is the directive was meant to safeguard consumers through tightening of safety measures and not a blanket ban on maize imports from the region. What he said, CS Munya, was, when we regulate imports, we are putting in place safety measures. Even the food that we produce must be subjected to processes that conform with public health and food safety standards. So he was saying, we have not banned the importation of maize from these two countries. What we're just saying is that we want strict enforcement of regulatory measures to make sure that this grain is actually safe for consumption before we allow it into the market. So it had been taken out of context. Do you think it's being taken out of context? Do you think it's people overreacting, or do you think it's actually pressure from interested quarters that said, you can't ban importation right now?
Well, I mean, if you ban importation, what do? It's that you essentially, right now, look at it, you essentially take a cheaper option out of the market. And what are people crying for right now?
Yep.
In as much as there's protectionism that needs to be applied when it comes to Kenya's indigenous farmers and business owners in that way, what you're essentially doing is that you're removing a cheaper option from the market. Because let's just be honest, anything that's coming from the neighboring countries right now at this moment is cheaper. And we've seen the reasons for that. That the source, that your agricultural materials, your inputs are much cheaper in other countries. That one we can't deny. So by the time you put it all together, even to bring it into the country is much cheaper than what is locally available. So with the ban right now, who's going to cry at the end of the day? The Kenyans who are purchasing these items. So with that ban, you remove a cheap option for people. And you're going to force them to stick with a more expensive option.
But
if
with
you just
that
want to
ban,
look at it on the face of it.
If you just want to look at it from
like
that
that,
face.
yes.
But also maybe with the strict enforcement of regulations, you're actually safeguarding your citizens.
Whereas you could also be making sure that the government makes this environment for business conducive. It is possible to lower the elements that make these resources so expensive. It is possible to regulate in that manner. Whereby I do agree 100% that we should do all that we can to protect our local farmers. At the same time, we should also be doing a lot more to make sure that the inputs that they have to bring in are affordable. They don't just cry because there's competition from outside. They also cry because their profit margins are so low because they have to put in so much to get this yield. So there's two things that can be done here.
Let's bring in a guest, and this is somebody who understands the agricultural landscape in Kenya very well, not just in Kenya, but in the region. He's the Regional Director for Sigenta Foundation, George Osure. He's with us on the line. George, good morning.
Good morning to you all, and happy to join you.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room, and thank you very much for joining us. So, George, you know what has been happening there. Recent debacle about maize imports from the regional neighbors. If we were to talk about that whole issue of the imports from neighboring countries, first of all, why is it that you'd find food from Tanzania, food from Uganda being cheaper than food being produced locally? Why?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And one of the reasons for that is the nature and style of farming. And that is basically the agricultural practices. We have certified seed is what most of our farmers use. And to produce certified seed, there are costs related to that. And there are what we call open pollinated varieties, which are called standard varieties. Those ones are the ones which are much cheaper to produce. And their costs of regulation are very different. Now, that's one side of it. The second side of it is that the cost of labor here in Kenya, in our maize producing areas, is much higher because of our much higher levels of mechanization. In those other areas, there's a lot more that is done with lower cost labor. So as an opener, I don't know where that places the conversation. Thank you.
You know, when you say that there's a cost variation, it sounds that on the one hand, you're saying that it's because of advantage of our advancement in agricultural practice that our costs are expensive. Or on the other hand, it's because of not proper advancement of agricultural practice that is making our food more expensive. Which is which? I'm still confused.
It's a combination of the two. Because when you are growing maize, one of the challenges in growing maize is that, without going into the very high technical details, is you need material or fertilizer to strengthen the root. And the roots are the root propagation to absorb the nutrients from the soil. So if your soils are acidic, I don't want to go into the very high level details, that reduces it, and that reduces the growth of the plant, and that reduces your yield.
Yeah.
But on the other side, if you are growing it in an area whereby it is new, it has not been farmed for too long, like in some parts of East Africa, that again changes the gross margin, which is the cost right from plowing right to harvesting. The third part of it is that our agriculture is a lot more advanced, and the farmers are looking at much higher levels of input quality. So at the moment, as we speak now, there are newer varieties of maize seed that will come into the market that are tolerant and speak towards fall armyworm. So those are issues that are different in the different parts of the region or in East Africa.
Well, even if you have these new variations that come about and you have greater technological advances when it comes to then agriculture, at the same time, we still have things like shortages. And then we still have the option of bringing in maize from other countries where people are looking to buy food and they cannot. And the option that comes along is something that comes from outside the country. How do you balance the two? Even if we have these technological advances, we still have the option of we have a cheaper option coming from outside the country. When people are thinking about what they're going to buy to put on their table, they're not thinking about the technology. They're thinking about the availability and also the affordability.
Very important point you raised, affordability. And the point we are mentioning here is something called the neighborhood effect, as the economists call it. And that is that if you look at the maize calendar across East Africa, by June, you are harvesting in the western part of Kenya, in Uganda. And as you approach towards September, you are going towards the eastern part of Kenya. So up to Meru and the Central Highland. So that is also another challenge. That point is that the person who has maize in June is ready. The manufacturer, the feed processor here requires the feed. He doesn't have local food. So you are speaking on to the challenges of balancing the two. I don't know if that is clear enough. That calendar is also very critical in sales. That's a very critical part of it.
So how does that roll over into the neighboring countries, as you're saying, the neighborhood effect?
Yes, what happens is now they harvest earlier than us. And as the introduction, they had a lower production cost. So naturally, because manufacturing here has got very tight margins, then we have, or processing here has very tight margins, then therefore there's the natural attraction towards the importation.
Right.
That's the way I'd put it.
So what we are witnessing now, where there's a lot of imports coming in from those neighboring countries, this is Tanzania and Uganda, and getting to a point where the FAA is concerned about the safety of this grain. What does the regulation framework look like in terms of ensuring that yes, you can import, but we have got to check that it is safe for consumption?
That's a very good point, and it's that's a very specialized part of the process, and that's why we have the labs, and we have actually very elaborate legal framework which subjects the crops or whatever we are importing or exporting out of the country to minimal levels. I don't have the figures right now offhand. Now that is where the challenge comes in, because a little bit of mishandling can create that challenge. The second part of it is that knowing that you will potentially have that, and I use the word knowing very carefully because that's a knowledge dissemination issue, is that the farmers don't know that if they mixed their seed in advance with something called aflatoxin, you would not have that problem in the beginning. And then you have a proper storage mechanism. So it's a lot of convening factors. I call them their points of convergence at every point in the growing period.
Okay. So now with these calls to ban or not to ban, what do you think would be the best? What are we looking at now in terms of options? Should we ban exports from other countries in terms of maize, when, in my opinion, certain things that should be done on this side are not being done? One, protectionism when it comes to then farmers and, protection of prices and things like that, protection of the business. On the other hand, doing everything possible to make sure that the inputs are as affordable as possible for farmers. Should we then go ahead and ban these imports from other countries?
That's a very good question and a very big challenge to the policymakers, because one of the issues that comes about is the minute you react to, because of an issue like aflatoxin to another country, they will also react by saying, we won't touch any of your products, something you've manufactured. That's the normal reaction in world trade and internationally. So one of the starting point is a conversation which I believe should be held the year before for next year, so that these issues can be lifted off. And the important people who need to be involved in this conversation are the processors. If you look at the way maize is processed, it requires a certain moisture content. The farmers know how to measure that moisture content by just feeling it. But the specialists use lab materials, so there's that gap. So there'll be a small 0.2% or very tiny percentage that can create the rejection. And the same happens with exports. So it's something that should be done, if you can look at it in the form of a forward market contract, looking ahead, not today. Because if you have to be careful, because right now, some of that maize may have been paid for last year, grow for me this year. So how do you handle such contracts? Those are the challenges that comes in. But at the same time, when you look at the way agriculture standards are positioned, they've got a bit of latitude, and the similar and nutrition, because it's human life, the latitude is very limited. It's either yes or no almost. I'm just putting it. I'm not a medical person. So I'd put it that way, very generally.
So how then do you enforce this? And I hear what you're saying. If you have a conversation a year before at the point of getting into planting between the processor who's going to offtake from the farmer and the farmer, where does the government come in? Because the government is one that's supposed to protect me as a consumer at the end of it all. Where does the government come in to ensure that what you guys have agreed as a business entity is fine, but what crosses the border shall be safe?
Good point. And I think that speaks to the point of registration of importers. So that registration is similar to the way we I'd compare it to the way we register feed merchants in this country. So feed merchants are registered so that it's predictable and the intellectual property is protected. So if we register the importers, and the importers can demonstrate to government, this is a very personal view, that have already done so much. And I think the critical element would be, what actions have you taken towards drying the maize effectively, storage, and within your growing gross margin? Can you demonstrate that your point of contact, who is growing for you, who is your outgrower, is using all methods possible, including specialized chemicals to protect against aflatoxin? I think we would get there.
And then what would then at that point, the AFA, for example, this Agriculture Food Authority, is looking at making sure that what is coming into the country is safe. If it detects that there's a growing percentage of the imports crossing through the border that are not safe, should it issue a blanket ban and say, first of all, stop all imports for X number of days as we test? Or should it be having a conversation and saying, you know what, politically, like those things that you said, the dynamics that come into it, it could affect our trade relations with our neighbor? What should it do, and what trumps the other in terms of interests?
Okay, I don't have the act that governs the operations within AFA, but what happens with some of these things is always, even the way we are talking here, is the modern style of communication, the way you do it. It gives the opportunity to the other person also to react and to see and tell you, by the way, yes, I have this problem, or could you allow for this? There's that conversation. That's what I mean. And that's one. The second part of it is, as we look at the issues that are raised by an instant ban, it could also be part of it is naturally, and they must look after it. I use the word must with an underline about public health and quality of food. But on the other side is they also need to bring in the manufacturers, the processors, the Millers Association of Kenya to ensure that there are no production gaps which will raise prices, like I think in the introduction we were talking about. Those gaps are the ones which jack up the prices. So it's a very difficult situation, and it needs a quick and a very efficient reaction. So I think it's more of a communication style and the timing of the communication. That's where I'd look at it. Yes.
I mean, obviously, if we look at the sector as a whole now, obviously it's one that needs massive interventions to kind of curb these problems that have befuddled it for the last, I don't know how many years. And there's certain things that need to be done. And if we just look at trade across the borders, that's one huge issue. But what do you think are some of the basic issues that need to be tackled before we even graduate to some of these ones? Because it would seem that once we say stop trade of this particular commodity, if there's a threat, it looks like there are very many other steps that we have not gone through before we can do that on its own. So what do you think? What do you see now are some of the issues that need to be tackled and need to be tackled now, before we get to the point where you can say now there's a good flow within the entire system?
Yeah, very good question, because one of the biggest challenges the farmers had, and I think I alluded to it briefly, is information, the quality and the nature of information they get in the region. And this has come about because of extension services and the type of extension services we have. So one of the aspects, if you look at the way I'll just talk about maize and the way maize feed is registered today, if Spice FM becomes a maize merchant, one of the questions you'll be asked is, do you have people in the field who can talk about this maize? That's essentially what it asks you, is one of the boxes you have to tick. The second part of it is, once we have done that, something that has quietly come about and is now creating a lot of interest in the private sector and in the growers' world is CALRO, the Livestock Research Organization. And across the regions, most of them have the same. Naro in Uganda and Tari in Tanzania. They have what you call soil survey maps. They tell you what is appropriate for what area. So you might be able to grow cassava here, maize here, and so on. That's the second part of it. The third part of it is that soil survey map and the details behind it are the ones which enable you to select fertilizer and with the appropriate timing of maize. So just to sort of help out is to emphasize is that you can have 4 packets of maize in front of you.
Yeah.
One can only grow at a certain altitude towards the coast. The next one would grow in the central, in the eastern area. The next one will grow in the central highlands. The next one requires very heavy rainfall. So that is the information the farmers would know, because the farmers who grow maize at scale know that, but the ordinary farmers don't have that idea. And the last part of it is the drier areas don't have these problems a lot because they are hot and dry, so the maize dries up quicker.
Yeah.
So that's why there's more investment in eastern Kenya now than towards the western. So there's a lot of issues.
George Osure, we thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insights. George is the Regional Director for Sigenta Foundation. Now, Syngenta is known as a global giant when it comes to agriculture. But what is the Sigenta Foundation? What do you do as we conclude?
Yes, thank you very much. The Sigenta Foundation is an organization that is the philanthropic arm of the Sigenta, the business. But the interesting part of it is by regulation, because it's headquartered in Switzerland, we do not propagate the aspects required or the business requirements of Sigenta, the business. Our role and my role in the region has been to disseminate knowledge and technology. Knowledge and technology means we've been able to bring in new seed varieties. We've been able to support maize lethal necrosis by contributing to a center in Naivasha. We've been able to bring in, together with the Soya Innovation Labs in the US, new varieties of soybean that are under trial. Some have been adopted. So there's that element we do. That's one side. The second side we do is to support small agricultural businesses to grow. So there are farms in Rift, Northern Upper Rift, which are in Trans Nzoia, who are now sharing part of their land as part of crop rotation between beans and maize, and growing bean seed and selling to farmers in Bungoma, in Busia, and so on. So that's the kind of work we do. And lastly, apart from that, we support government and associations with specialist personnel from across the world to solve technical issues.
In other words, George, you are a knowledge hub. Thank you very much. We hope to tap into your knowledge in coming days again. George Osure, Regional Director, Syngenta Foundation. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice.
And time for us to take a break again on KTN Home, 4 minutes to 9. This conversation continues on Spice FM. In the next hour, we have a conversation with government spokesman Colonel Cyrus Aguna as we commemorate 1 year since the first COVID-19 case was detected in the country. We'll ask him a number of questions and we want you to tune in. Spice FM 94.4 in Nairobi. If you're in Mombasa, you can tune in on 87.9. Kisumu is 102.5. Nakuru 96.0. 96.7 in Eldoret, Nyeri is 90.9 and Malindi 97.7. You can now switch from TV onto FM. Good morning, it's 4 minutes to 9.
Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise. Yeah!
You're listening to Spice FM. Spice FM, Nyeri.
You know, the thing is, there's so much knowledge in the agricultural sector, both in the Ministry of Agriculture and the various state departments. In all the other agricultural organizations, CalRO is one of them. The AFA is basically has very many knowledgeable people. If you look at now organizations such as the Syngenta Foundation and others, there's so much knowledge in agriculture in the country that if all those people brought their heads together and they said, let's look at, for example, addressing cost of production, what is it that the government can do in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of enforcement, it can actually happen. We can have the cheapest food.
Absolutely.
We can have the best soils.
With the best technological advances, all of that can happen.
It just needs to, people just need to do what they're supposed to do at all levels. And then we'd get to that point where food is cheap, food is always available. The issue of food and nutrition security would not even be an issue that we discuss for a very long time, because we'd be knowing that whatever part of the country you go to, there's food that comes from that part. Because we know what can grow in the lower parts, what can grow in the middle parts, what can grow in the highlands, what can grow in the northern highlands, what can grow in the arid and semi-arid, what can be produced from there. If it's livestock, we have all this information.
Yep.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day. Spice up your life.